For centuries, people have whispered about a place that vanished without a trace. A city of shining walls, marble towers, and endless knowledge, swallowed by the sea in a single day and night. Some called it a myth, others a memory, but its name has never faded. Atlantis, was it ever real, or only a warning from the ancient world? The story began more than 2,000 years ago, in the writings of the philosopher Plato, who spoke of an island beyond the pillars of Heracles, where a proud civilization fell beneath the waves. Since then, explorers, scholars, and dreamers have searched for it, in maps, in ruins, and in the deep. Tonight, we'll travel through that story, not to prove or deny it, but to see how the legend of Atlantis was born, why it endured, and what it reveals about the people who first imagined it. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Boring History for Sleep, where history drifts slowly, quietly, and never hurries to its end. Long before the word Atlantis became a symbol for mystery, it existed only in the mind of one man, a philosopher who lived in Athens more than 2,000 years ago. His name was Plato, and the world he lived in was still trying to make sense of memory, myth, and the fragile line that separated truth from imagination. Plato wrote about many things: justice, education, the nature of reality itself. But among his most enduring writings are two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. It was in these works, written around 360 BCE, that the story of Atlantis first appeared. Unlike legends passed through generations, this one came from a single written voice. There were no songs, no folk tales, no earlier mentions. Atlantis began on a page, described with the precision and calm of philosophy that in Timaeus. Plato introduced Atlantis as a story told by his ancestor Solon, one of the wise lawgivers of Athens. According to the dialogue, Solon had traveled to Egypt centuries earlier, where he spoke with priests who preserved the oldest records of the world. There, they told him of a powerful island nation that had existed 9,000 years before their time, far beyond the pillars of Heracles, the ancient name for what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. This island, they said, was larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined. It was ruled by a great and prosperous people who possessed vast knowledge, wealth, and naval power. Their capital city was built in concentric rings of land and water, a perfect design of harmony and defense. Its walls were said to gleam with precious metals, brass, tin, and a mysterious red metal called orichalcum. Second only to gold in value, at the center of this city stood a temple to Poseidon, god of the sea, surrounded by gardens, fountains, and stables filled with horses. Canals crossed the island, connecting the capital to the ocean. Ships moved constantly through its harbors, bringing goods from distant lands. Atlantis, in Plato's words, was not only powerful but orderly, a society built on reason and virtue. But as the story unfolded, he added another layer, a warning. The Atlanteans, over time, grew proud and greedy. Their love of wisdom gave way to a hunger for conquest. They began to expand their empire, subduing neighboring islands and parts of the Mediterranean. Their armies reached as far as Egypt and Italy, until they were finally stopped by the only state that could resist them, ancient Athens. Here, Plato shifted the tale from geography to morality. He described how the Athenians, representing virtue and moderation, stood against the might of Atlantis and prevailed. The gods, seeing the arrogance of the Atlanteans, decided to punish them. In a single day and night of misfortune, the island was struck by violent earthquakes and floods, and it sank beneath the sea, disappearing forever. That was the story, simple, direct, and moral in purpose. Atlantis was not introduced as fantasy, but as allegory. Plato never claimed to have seen it or found evidence of it. He presented it as a teaching, an example of how civilizations, no matter how advanced, could fall if they abandoned virtue For Plato's readers, the message was clear. He was not giving them a map. He was holding up a mirror. Atlantis, like many of his ideas, was a reflection of human nature itself. Yet even in his calm, reasoned writing, the details of Atlantis were vivid. The circular city, the shining metals, the canals and mountains. These descriptions gave the story a texture that outlived its philosophy. People remembered not just the moral, but the image, a great city swallowed by the sea, after Plato's death. His students continued to study his dialogues, but few treated the story as literal history. His disciple Aristotle, when asked about Atlantis, is said to have replied, "He who invented it also destroyed it." To him, it was a metaphor, nothing more. Still, the idea lingered. For the next 2 millennia, Atlantis existed quietly in manuscripts, copied by scribes, read by scholars, but never lost entirely. In medieval libraries and monastic collections, Plato's Timaeus and Critias were preserved even as empires rose and fell. The legend of the sunken city waited, sleeping in ink and parchment. What made the story endure was not its claim to truth, but its balance between possibility and lesson. Plato did not say Atlantis was a place of magic. He said it was a place of order, a place that fell not because of sorcery, but because of human weakness. That distinction kept the story credible, even as centuries passed. When scholars of the Renaissance rediscovered Plato's works, they found in Atlantis something both philosophical and poetic. Europe in the 15th century was full of explorers, cartographers, and dreamers. New lands were being found across the oceans, and the boundaries of the known world were expanding. Suddenly, the idea of a lost island beyond the Western Sea did not seem impossible. But to understand Atlantis as Plato wrote it, one must return to its original purpose. His dialogues were not histories, they were exercises in thought. Each character in his writings represents a question, a doubt, or a lesson. The story of Atlantis, told within this framework, was part of a larger discussion about the creation of the universe, the nature of good governance, and the destiny of human societies. In Critias, which he left unfinished, Plato went further, describing Atlantis in meticulous detail, its geography, its laws, its rulers. He explained how its founders were the sons of Poseidon, each ruling over a portion of the island. He described their code of conduct, their respect for justice, and their gradual decline as wealth and ambition overtook virtue. The story broke off mid-sentence, unfinished at the very moment where Critias, the speaker in the dialogue, was about to continue. We do not know if Plato ever intended to complete it. Perhaps he felt he had said enough. That unfinished quality added another layer of mystery. It left readers wondering what else might have been revealed, whether more truths, more warnings, or more descriptions of the lost island had been planned. The gap invited imagination. Plato's use of Atlantis was consistent with his philosophical method. He used imagined societies to explore real ideas, just as he described the ideal city in the Republic to explain justice. He used Atlantis to explore corruption and downfall. In both, he showed that the health of a society depended not on its wealth or size, but on the virtue of its citizens. Over time, people forgot that moral center and remembered the spectacle instead. The shining walls, the rings of water, the final storm, these became the focus. The philosopher's caution turned into legend. Still, even stripped of its original purpose, the story retained a peculiar weight. Unlike myths of gods and monsters, Atlantis had a logic that appealed to reason. It felt possible. It belonged not to religion, but to history's edge, the point where memory fades into myth. When later generations searched for Atlantis, they were not searching for Plato's idea, but for the image his words had created. Yet every expedition, every theory, and every map traced back to those few pages written in Athens, in a time when the known world was much smaller, and imagination filled its borders to Plato's Atlantis. Then, was never a ruin to be found, but a thought to be remembered, a reminder that even the greatest civilizations could vanish, not by divine wrath, but by their own choices. As his words survived the fall of empires and the passage of centuries, they carried more than a story. They carried a question. Was Atlantis only a lesson, or could it have been real? That question would become the heartbeat of centuries of curiosity, pushing explorers to search beyond maps and historians to search beneath time. For Plato, it was enough that his readers understood the meaning. For those who came after, it became something else entirely, the beginning of one of the world's longest searches for a city that may never have existed. When Plato wrote of Atlantis, he was not trying to hide a map within his words. He was writing at a time when the world itself was searching for meaning, a time when Greece stood at the crossroads between old myths and new reason. To understand why he imagined a city that would rise and fall beneath the waves, one must first understand the world in which he lived. Plato was born around 427 BCE, during the golden age of Athens, a city of art, philosophy, and politics, but also one shadowed by war. His lifetime spanned the Peloponnesian War, a long and bitter conflict between Athens and Sparta that left much of Greece exhausted and divided. He saw firsthand how pride and ambition could destroy even the greatest states. What had once been a beacon of democracy had turned, for a time, into a city ruled by faction, fear, and corruption. For a philosopher, this collapse was not just political, it was moral. Athens had prided itself on freedom, but its downfall showed what happened when power outweighed virtue. In that sense, Plato did not need to imagine the fall of Atlantis. He had seen a version of it in his own lifetime. The city beneath the sea was, in many ways, a reflection of Athens above it. Plato belonged to a generation that had lost its certainty. The gods of old were still honored, but faith in them was no longer absolute. Thinkers like Socrates, Plato's teacher, had begun asking questions that myths could not answer. What was justice? What was good? How should a city be ruled? These were not questions of legend, but of reason. Philosophy in Athens had become a way to rebuild order, a new foundation for society after the chaos of war. Plato's writings, filled with imagined dialogues between wise men, were part of that search. Through conversation, he tested ideas, what it meant to live well, to govern wisely, to seek truth beyond appearances. When he wrote about Atlantis, then it was not to entertain. It was to warn. The story fit naturally into his larger project, to explore the difference between virtue and excess, between the love of wisdom and the hunger for control. Plato's own teacher, Socrates, had been condemned to death by the city he sought to enlighten. That event left a deep mark on him. It convinced Plato that even a society that claimed to value justice could betray it when swayed by pride or ignorance. His dialogues became both memorials and lessons, reminders of what could go wrong when reason was silenced. In this context, Atlantis was more than a lost island. It was an example, a distant mirror reflecting the same moral truths. A civilization blessed with power and knowledge had fallen because it forgot humility. To Plato's readers, the message was unmistakable. The story was not about geography. It was about balance. The Greece of Plato's time was also a place of contrasts. On one hand, it produced mathematics, architecture, and philosophy that would shape the world for millennia. On the other, it remained bound by the same flaws that had always haunted humanity: rivalry, greed, and restlessness. In the agora, or public square, ideas were debated as fiercely as battles were fought. Knowledge was admired, but power was pursued with equal passion. Plato watched these tensions unfold and sought to explain them through writing. In the Republic, he imagined an ideal city governed by philosopher kings, rulers guided not by ambition, but by understanding. In Timaeus and Critias, where the tale of Atlantis appears, he shifted from the ideal to the fallen. Together, They formed a pair, one city of virtue, the other of decline. One stood as a model, the other as a warning. His choice to frame Atlantis as an ancient memory was deliberate. By placing it far in the past, beyond the reach of history, he gave the story a timeless quality. It was not about any one people. It was about all people. The further he set it from his own world, the closer it came to representing human nature itself. To the Athenians, this approach was familiar. They were heirs to a long tradition of moral storytelling. Their poets had spoken of heroes who rose and fell through the same patterns: courage, success, pride, and ruin. What made Plato's version different was his method. He removed the gods from the center of the story and replaced them with choices. The destruction of Atlantis was not an act of divine jealousy, but a consequence of imbalance. In that sense, Plato's world was standing between two ages, the mythic and the rational. He used the language of myth to teach the logic of reason. Atlantis was not a fairy tale. It was a philosophical instrument. Through it, he could discuss the fragility of order, the limits of human ambition, and the unseen laws that govern civilizations. The dialogues in which Atlantis appears were written late in Plato's life, when his thought had matured into reflection. He had founded his own school, the Academy, a place where students gathered to study mathematics, astronomy, and ethics. The Academy was not a temple, but a grove, open to discussion, quiet, shaded, a place where questions mattered more than answers. There, surrounded by pupils, he would have spoken of balance, proportion, and the harmony of nature and mind, themes that also shaped his description of Atlantis. The circular design of the city, the symmetry of its canals and temples, mirrored his belief in geometry as the foundation of order. For Plato, harmony was not just a matter of music or art, but of morality. A city, like a soul, must be balanced. When one part dominates, whether appetite, pride, or power, the whole begins to crumble. This was the deeper structure of his story. Atlantis represented the human soul enlarged to the size of an empire. Its downfall, then, was not only political, it was psychological. It was what happened when reason gave way to desire. In the Athens of his time, this message was not abstract. The wounds of the Peloponnesian War were still fresh. Entire generations had seen wealth and glory lead to ruin. The parallels were unmistakable. In his calm, deliberate tone, Plato was telling his readers what history had already shown them, that no city, no matter how great, could endure without self-knowledge. Yet, there was another side to his world, one of curiosity and exploration. Greek sailors were venturing farther west into the Atlantic, reaching new islands and coastlines. Reports from travelers described lands beyond the known seas. These accounts may have inspired the vivid geography of Atlantis, not as evidence, but as color. Plato used what was imaginable to make what was moral feel real. His audience understood that. The Greeks of the classical age knew how to listen to a story with both the ear of a poet and the mind of a philosopher. They did not demand proof of every word. They sought meaning. To them, the tale of Atlantis was neither fact nor fiction. It was wisdom wrapped in narrative. Still, the detail with which Plato described it gave the story endurance. He wrote with the precision of an architect, not the vagueness of a mythmaker. Readers could almost see the harbors, the temples, the mountains rising behind the city. The realism of the description blurred the line between allegory and memory. That was part of his genius. In the centuries that followed, scholars argued over his intent. Some said Atlantis was an invention, a tool for teaching. Others suggested he had drawn upon older traditions, perhaps stories from Egypt or the Aegean. But the truth may be simpler. He created a myth with the discipline of a philosopher, shaping imagination into a mirror for ethics. In Plato's time, history and myth were not opposites. They were layers of understanding. A story could be untrue in fact and still carry truth and meaning. By writing about Atlantis, he joined a lineage of thinkers who used imagination to ask moral questions that history alone could not answer. His world was changing, but the core of his concern, the rise and fall of human order, remained universal. To the philosophers of Athens, Atlantis was a lesson. To later generations, it would become a mystery. The difference lay not in the words, but in what people chose to hear. In the end, Plato gave the world a story that outlived its time because it asked a timeless question. What happens when knowledge outpaces wisdom? The world of Athens had already begun to see that question unfold. The world that followed would never stop asking it. When Plato described Atlantis, he did so with the care of an observer, not a storyteller. His details were measured, his language precise. Every sentence was designed to sound credible, as if he were recording memory, not myth. The island, he said, lay beyond the Pillars of Heracles, far out into the Atlantic Ocean, where it ruled over many other islands and lands. To his readers, this phrase alone sparked wonder. The Pillars of Heracles referred to the narrow strait we now call Gibraltar, the gateway from the Mediterranean into the open sea. In Greek thought, that strait marked the boundary between the known and the unknown. Beyond it stretched a vast, mysterious ocean, rarely sailed and poorly understood. By placing Atlantis there, Plato set his story at the edge of the world, a place both real and unreachable. He described the island as larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, immense, fertile, and rich in natural resources. Mountains ringed its northern side, sheltering broad plains that stretched toward the sea. The soil was deep and dark, producing abundant crops twice a year. Streams flowed from the hills, feeding canals and reservoirs. The air was mild, the seasons gentle. It was, in his words, a land favored by the gods. At its center stood the great capital city, a marvel of design and symmetry. It was built in 3 concentric rings of land and water, connected by bridges and guarded by gates. The outermost ring contained the harbors and shipyards. The middle ring held gardens, temples, and baths. And the innermost was the royal enclosure, where the temple of Poseidon rose above all. This temple, built of silver, gold, and ivory, was said to shine like fire in the sunlight. Around the temple stood statues of kings and horses, fountains of clear water, one warm, one cool, and fields where sacred animals roamed freely. The palace walls were covered in orichalcum, a metal now lost to history, which Plato described as glowing with a reddish hue. Whether orichalcum was a poetic invention or a reference to real bronze alloys remains unknown, but in his time it suggested beauty, wealth, and mystery. The city's plan reflected the Greek ideal of harmony, order expressed through geometry. Everything was measured, proportioned, and balanced. To Plato, this was not just decoration but philosophy. The design of Atlantis symbolized unity between nature and intellect, between the sea and the land, between the mortal and the divine. Beyond the capital, the island was divided into 10 regions, each ruled by a descendant of Poseidon. The god, according to the tale, had fallen in love with a mortal woman named Cleito and fathered 10 sons with her. Each son governed a part of the island, but the eldest, Atlas, gave his name to the land and ruled from the central city. Though this detail was mythological in form, its meaning was political. It reflected Plato's fascination with order and governance, the balance between autonomy and unity. The rulers of Atlantis, he wrote, were bound by a shared law. Every few years, they met in the capital to deliberate on matters of war and trade, and to renew their loyalty to one another. Their law was inscribed on a column of orichalcum within the temple, where they swore oaths to act justly and preserve peace. The image is striking: 10 kings kneeling before a pillar of shining metal, sacrificing bulls, and pouring wine in solemn ritual. Yet beneath the ceremony was a lesson. that even the mightiest rulers must answer to something higher than themselves. The Atlanteans were described as both practical and skilled. They built bridges, harbors, and canals that linked the sea to the inland plains. They harnessed the flow of rivers, tamed the earth, and adorned their cities with color and stone. Their architecture blended function and beauty, grand temples alongside workshops, and wide roads lined with trees. Plato wrote that their navy was vast, thousands of ships and crews trained in navigation. Their merchant fleets traded across distant waters, bringing in metals, spices, and animals unknown to the Mediterranean. Their army was equally disciplined, 60,000 soldiers drawn from the countryside, each trained and ready. They possessed both strength and intellect, mastery of the sea and the land alike. But even as he described their achievements, Plato allowed hints of imbalance to enter. The Atlanteans, he said, were noble at first, pure in spirit and gentle in their dealings. Yet, as generations passed, their divine nature weakened. The human part of them grew stronger, and with it came greed and vanity. They no longer honored moderation. Their wealth, once a means of comfort, became an idol. Their order, once born of reason, turned into ambition. The empire of Atlantis began to expand. Their fleets sailed eastward, conquering lands as far as Egypt and Tyrrhenia. Their cities grew rich from tribute, and their rulers boasted of power beyond the gods themselves. To Plato, this was not mere storytelling. It was allegory in motion. The decline of Atlantis reflected the decline of any civilization that placed wealth above wisdom. The geography of the island, though described with such precision, was also symbolic. The circular city suggested unity, but also entrapment, a perfection that could not evolve. The mountains symbolized strength, the plains abundance, but together they hinted at excess. Plato, ever the philosopher, designed his world not only as a place, but as a thought to modernize. The level of detail seems unusual for a moral tale. He gave measurements, lengths, distances, numbers of ships, the size of the army, the depth of canals. Some scholars have suggested that he drew inspiration from real places known to the Greeks. The island civilizations of Crete or Thera, where the Minoans had built advanced societies long before classical Greece. The eruption of Thera, which devastated the Aegean centuries earlier, might have provided a natural model for a world swallowed by the sea, but for Plato, accuracy was never the point. His description of Atlantis was meant to convince the reader that such a place could exist, so that the lesson would feel real. By grounding imagination in realism, he made philosophy tangible. The people of Atlantis, as he described them, lived lives of luxury. Their homes were decorated with metals and fine stone. Their markets overflowed with goods from distant lands. Music, art, and science flourished. They were, in his words, rich beyond measure. And yet, this very abundance led to their undoing. In their comfort, they forgot discipline. In their success, they forgot humility. Plato's readers would have recognized this pattern immediately. Greek tragedy was built on the same rhythm, hubris followed by downfall. In his time, Athens itself had seen its empire grow and collapse under the weight of pride. The story of Atlantis, though set far away, was painfully familiar. He described how, in their arrogance, the Atlanteans sought to dominate the known world. They waged war against the free peoples of the Mediterranean. But one city stood against them, Athens. In Plato's retelling, Athens represented virtue, a small but disciplined power guided by justice rather than greed. The Athenians, through courage and balance, defeated the Atlantean armies. It was a triumph of moral strength over material might. And then, in a single day and night of catastrophe, the sea rose. Earthquakes shook the land. The proud island, with its shining walls and mighty harbors, vanished beneath the waves. Plato described it calmly, almost coldly. In one grievous day and night, the island of Atlantis disappeared into the depths of the sea. He left it at that. No divine anger, no fiery spectacle, just water, silence, and the end of arrogance. For the philosopher, this was enough. The geography of Atlantis, its people and power, served to show how the greatest order could decay into chaos. The island was not a paradise lost, but a civilization undone by its own hand. What made Plato's account so enduring was not that it claimed to record history, but that it sounded as though it might. His words were calm, his tone observational, his details plausible. He wrote not as a prophet, but as an analyst. The world he described felt human, structured by intelligence, undone by excess. Centuries later, explorers and scholars would read these passages and treat them as directions. They would search maps and oceans, forgetting that the true landscape of Atlantis was moral, not physical. The lost island was not somewhere to be found. It was something to be understood. The strength of the story lies in its simplicity, a land of abundance, a people of pride, a moment of loss. Its message would echo across millennia, that civilization, no matter how advanced, is always built on the fragile ground of virtue. In Plato's telling, the story of Atlantis reached its quiet turning point not through war or invasion, but through something far simpler, a change in the human heart. For generations, the Atlanteans had lived with balance. They had honored the order of their laws, worked in harmony with the sea and soil, and ruled with restraint. But time, as Plato so often reminded his readers, wears down even the strongest foundations. What began as moderation slowly turned to pride. At first, the signs were small. A little more greed in trade, a little more luxury in the homes of the rich. The kings of Atlantis, who had once met in ceremony to renew their vows of justice, began to see themselves as divine. The metal orichalcum that once shone on their temples now gleamed on their armor. Their ships, once made for commerce, carried soldiers. The island's heart, its perfect circles of order, began to spin out of balance. Plato wrote of this transformation in a tone both restrained and final. When the divine portion within them grew faint, he said, and their human nature gained the upper hand, they became unable to bear their prosperity. It was a simple sentence, but it carried the weight of an entire philosophy. In his world, collapse did not come from outside. It came from within. The Atlanteans' empire stretched far beyond their shores. They had subjugated islands and coastal lands across the known world, demanding tribute and allegiance. Their fleets dominated the western seas. Even in the east, rumors of their reach were known. But the more their power grew, the less they remembered the principles that had built it. The Greeks who read these words. The pattern was unmistakable. They had seen it before, in Troy, in Persia, in Athens itself. Power invited excess, and excess invited ruin. Plato's genius was not in invention, but in reflection. He distilled history into a single moral image. The turning point of the story came when the Atlanteans sought to conquer Athens. It was an impossible ambition, an empire of the sea challenging a modest city of the mainland. Yet to Plato, this contrast was essential. Athens represented the human ideal, disciplined, rational, small, but principled. Atlantis represented the opposite, grand, gifted, but blind to its own limits. He described the clash briefly, almost sparingly. The Atlanteans advanced with vast armies, but the Athenians, guided by virtue, resisted. The war itself was less important than what it revealed, that moral strength could overcome material power. In the end, Athens triumphed, not through numbers or might, but through integrity. But victory brought no joy. For soon after, the gods of Olympus, or rather, the forces of nature that Plato personified as gods, turned their gaze upon Atlantis. The island that had once flourished now faced the consequence of its imbalance. There came mighty earthquakes and floods, he wrote, and in a single grievous day and night, the island of Atlantis sank beneath the sea. He offered no description of fire or thunder, no cries or chaos, just silence. The end of Atlantis, as Plato told it, was not a spectacle. It was an erasure. What had been beautiful was gone, and the sea covered its memory. It is easy today to imagine this as a myth of punishment, but Plato's intent was subtler. He did not describe vengeance. He described correction. To him, the universe was governed by harmony. When harmony was broken, when pride exceeded balance, the natural order restored itself. The fall of Atlantis was not wrath. It was equilibrium. The simplicity of this ending made it powerful. It needed no embellishment. The island vanished not because the gods were cruel, but because it had lost the qualities that allowed it to endure. For a philosopher, that was tragedy enough. In the centuries that followed, scholars debated whether Plato had invented the story entirely or borrowed it from older traditions. Egyptian priests, he said, had told it to Solon, an account preserved through millennia. Whether or not that was true mattered less than the meaning he gave it. The tale of Atlantis was not an archaeological record. It was a moral geography. It mapped the journey from wisdom to arrogance, from balance to ruin. Yet, even as Plato's intention was moral, the imagery of the fall captivated imagination. The thought of an island swallowed by the sea stirred something ancient in the human mind, a memory of floods and losses, of lands that disappeared. Ancient peoples all around the Mediterranean had stories of such events. The Greeks told of Deucalion's flood, the Mesopotamians of a deluge that wiped out humankind. Plato's version was quieter, but no less haunting. He described the aftermath briefly. The sea where Atlantis had stood, he said, became shallow and impassable, clogged with mud. Ships could no longer cross it. The once bright waters turned dull, as if the ocean itself mourned what it had taken. For centuries after, he claimed, sailors spoke of that region as a place of silt and ruin. Whether this was poetic invention or memory of a geological event, it added a touch of realism that made the myth endure. What made the fall of Atlantis unforgettable was its restraint. Plato avoided the language of spectacle. He did not speak of roaring waves or blazing skies. He left space, a silence that allowed readers to imagine the rest. In that silence lay the essence of tragedy, the understanding that what is lost cannot be reclaimed. Those who came after. The image of a great city sinking beneath the waves became more than metaphor. It became a symbol of impermanence, of pride, of the thin line between civilization and nature. Every empire that rose after Athens could see a reflection of itself in that fate. Rome, Byzantium, even the kingdoms of the Renaissance, all found in Atlantis a quiet warning written long before their time. But in Plato's Athens, the fall of Atlantis also served another purpose. It reminded the Greeks of their own vulnerability. The city that had defeated Persia and built an empire across the Aegean had also fallen to internal discord. The story of Atlantis was a mirror, showing what Athens had become after its golden age. There was a sense, too, that Plato was addressing something deeper, the cycle of history itself. To him, societies followed the same pattern as individuals: birth, growth, pride, decline, and renewal. The destruction of Atlantis was not final. It was part of a larger rhythm. Civilizations, like tides, rise and fall. The sea does not destroy, it resets. This idea of cycles shaped much of Greek thought. The seasons turned, empires changed, stars moved across the sky in predictable paths. Plato's Atlantis fit within that pattern. It was not the story of one event, but of all events repeated endlessly in human time. His readers would have recognized the echoes of another, quieter truth, that even in loss, there is preservation. The city was gone, but its story remained. In the calm of his words, Plato achieved what no monument could. He built a ruin that could never crumble. Later generations, searching for Atlantis on maps and ocean floors, often missed this point. They sought stone where Plato had left philosophy. They looked for walls beneath the sea instead of lessons within themselves. But the true Atlantis had already served its purpose. It had shown what happens when balance is forgotten. The philosopher never wrote a sequel to Critias. The dialogue ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as if the story itself had sunk with the island. Perhaps he intended it that way. The incompleteness left space for reflection, the silence after the fall, and so Atlantis passed from philosophy into legend. But in its fall, it carried something far more enduring than marble or gold. It carried the idea that all human greatness is temporary, that no city stands forever, and that the sea, patient, indifferent, eternal, always remembers. When readers of later centuries returned to Plato's pages, they found more than a lost island. They found themselves, reflected in the calm mirror of a story that had no ending, only return. After Plato's death, the story of Atlantis might easily have faded. One more allegory among his many writings, a parable understood only by students of philosophy. Yet somehow, this single tale endured when countless others were forgotten. It traveled quietly through time, carried not by certainty, but by curiosity. For nearly 2,000 years, no one sought Atlantis. The ancient world read Plato as philosopher, not geographer. His story was admired for its meaning, not its map. To his earliest readers, Timaeus and Critias were dialogues about virtue, the cosmos, and the moral order of the universe. Atlantis was part of that discussion, a symbol rather than a destination to eye in the centuries that followed. As Greece gave way to Rome, the legend of the sunken city drifted into obscurity. Roman thinkers like Cicero and Seneca quoted Plato often, but rarely mentioned Atlantis. To them, it was only one example of how the ancients spoke of floods and forgotten lands. Even Pliny the Elder, the great Roman naturalist who wrote about volcanoes, earthquakes, and islands swallowed by the sea, treated Atlantis as an allegory, not a real event. For a long time, the world moved on. The manuscripts that contained Plato's works slept in the quiet rooms of libraries and monasteries. Scholars copied them by hand, preserving each letter without knowing the full story they held. The sea of time grew deep, and Atlantis sank again, not into water, but into the silence of unread pages that it was not until the Middle Ages that curiosity stirred once more. In the 12th and 13th centuries, European scholars rediscovered many of the Greek philosophers through Arabic translations. Plato's words returned to the West, carried by scholars from Spain, Italy, and North Africa. Among his writings, the dialogues Timaeus and Critias appeared again, and with them, the legend of Atlantis. The medieval mind, however, saw the world differently. It did not separate myth from meaning, nor philosophy from faith. To the readers of that age, Atlantis was neither a metaphor nor a scientific possibility. It was a mystery. Some treated it as a story of divine judgment, others as a moral echo of ancient floods. Still, the legend was rarely the focus. The Middle Ages were more concerned with heaven than with lost islands beneath the sea. It was during the Renaissance that Atlantis began to awaken once more. The 15th and 16th centuries brought a hunger for knowledge, the rebirth of science, geography, and exploration. Old texts were reprinted, translated, and studied. The world was growing larger again. Ships sailed beyond known horizons. New lands were discovered across the Atlantic Ocean, the same ocean where Plato had placed his lost city. For the first time, the idea of Atlantis began to feel plausible. Scholars asked, could Plato's island have been a memory of real lands now submerged? Explorers wondered whether it might lie among the newly charted territories of the Western Sea. The discovery of the Americas in 1492 gave these thoughts new life. To some, the great continents across the ocean seemed like echoes of Atlantis itself, vast, fertile, and filled with ancient peoples unknown to Europe. Writers of the Renaissance blended this excitement with imagination. The philosopher Francis Bacon, in his 1627 work The New Atlantis, transformed Plato's myth into a vision of a utopian society built on reason and science. His New Atlantis was not the same as the original. It was an island of enlightenment and discovery, a place where knowledge replaced superstition. Yet the title alone showed how deeply the idea had endured. Atlantis had become a metaphor for the perfect world, not one lost, but one yet to be found. As exploration continued, maps began to include speculations. Some cartographers marked mysterious islands in the Atlantic with faint outlines and uncertain names: Antillia, Brazil, Isola de San Brandan. To the eyes of sailors, these could be the remnants of Plato's Atlantis. The line between history and hope blurred in the 17th and 18th centuries. As science and archaeology developed, curiosity about Atlantis took a new shape. Scholars began comparing Plato's description with real geography. The eruption of the island Thera, now called Santorini, became a subject of fascination. Its destruction, thousands of years earlier, had indeed covered cities in ash and caused tsunamis across the Aegean. Could this have been the event that inspired Plato? The question opened a door between geology and myth at the same time. Natural philosophers speculated about the sea itself. Was it possible that entire lands had once existed and then disappeared? The slow study of fossils and sediment suggested that the Earth changed over time, that continents rose and sank. In this shifting world, the idea of Atlantis no longer seemed impossible. By the 19th century, the legend had reached a new kind of audience, one fascinated by discovery, adventure, and science. The world was being mapped in detail, but the deep ocean remained largely unknown. Writers began to imagine what might still lie beneath its surface. In 1882, an American congressman and amateur scholar named Ignatius Donnelly published Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. His book claimed that Atlantis had been a real civilization, the source of all later cultures. Donnelly argued that ancient myths from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Americas shared common origins in Atlantis. His ideas were speculative, built more on enthusiasm than evidence, but they captured the imagination of the public. For the first time in history, Atlantis was treated as a global puzzle. People wrote essays, drew maps, and debated locations. Some placed it in the Atlantic Ocean near the Azores, others in the Mediterranean near Crete or Malta. A few pointed to the Caribbean or even Antarctica. The search became a reflection of each era's hopes and fears, a mirror for what people most wanted to find. In the early 20th century, the legend entered popular culture. Novelists, filmmakers, and explorers turned it into a symbol of mystery. The ocean floor became a stage for imagination. Submarines, newly invented, were seen as tools that might one day find the lost city. Scientists studying geology discovered evidence of ancient floods and shifting tectonic plates, which some took as hints of Atlantis. Meanwhile, serious archaeology advanced on its own path. Excavations in the Aegean uncovered the ruins of Minoan civilization, advanced, artistic, and suddenly destroyed around 1600 BCE by a volcanic eruption. The parallels to Plato's story were striking. An island, a powerful maritime culture, a sudden catastrophe. Many scholars began to see the story of Atlantis not as invention, but as memory, a distorted echo of real events retold through generations. And yet, the beauty of the legend lay in its openness. It could belong to science or poetry, to exploration or philosophy. It could mean many things and contradict them all. That flexibility kept it alive. In the 20th century, new tools deepened the ocean, but not the mystery. Sonar maps, satellites, and deep-sea expeditions revealed vast plains and mountain ranges beneath the Atlantic, but no city of marble or metal. Each discovery that disproved one theory gave birth to another. Atlantis was never truly lost, because it had never been found in the first place. It existed not as a location, but as an idea that refused to die. Historians today view the legend through Plato's own lens. To them, it remains a masterpiece of storytelling, a moral, a warning, a reflection of humanity's recurring pattern. Yet it is also a cultural artifact, a story that shaped centuries of imagination. Every age rewrote it in its own image. The ancient Greeks saw it as a lesson in virtue. The Renaissance saw it as a dream of discovery. The Victorians saw it as proof of human progress. The modern world sees it as an eternal question. Each version reveals less about the sea and more about ourselves. Even now, in an age of satellites and global maps, the word Atlantis still carries weight. It evokes a sense of something almost remembered, a civilization both near and far, both real and impossible. It endures because it asks a question that science alone cannot answer. What have we lost, and what have we forgotten? The echoes of Atlantis sound not in the ocean, but in the human mind, in our need to believe that something grand once existed, and that we might someday understand it. It is not proof we seek, but continuity, the comfort of knowing that stories, like civilizations, never disappear completely. They simply change form, moving from stone to memory, from memory to page, from page to thought. And so, the legend survived, not because it was true, but because it was alive. Each retelling gave it breath. Each skeptic, by arguing, kept it relevant. Each dreamer, by searching, ensured that the story of a city that sank would never itself be buried, from Plato's Athens to the screens of the modern world. Atlantis continues to float between fact and reflection, not a ruin beneath the sea, but a reminder above it, whispering that everything built by hands and minds is fragile, and everything lost to time may yet find another life in memory. By the time the modern age began, the story of Atlantis had already crossed from philosophy into obsession. It had survived for more than 2,000 years, through empires, languages, and revolutions, and now found itself in a world that finally possessed the tools to search for it. What had once been a parable became a question for science. If Plato wrote of Atlantis, could it have existed at all? The first to ask seriously were not adventurers, but scholars. In the 16th and 17th centuries, as the age of exploration expanded the boundaries of the known world, maps began to show not only new continents, but empty spaces, places that seemed large enough to hide a legend. The Atlantic Ocean, once feared as endless, had become a pathway between worlds. The discovery of the Americas renewed interest in Plato's Lost Island. If vast, unknown lands had existed across the sea all along, might Atlantis have been one of them? The Spanish chroniclers of the New World found echoes of the story in the ruins of Central and South America. They saw great stone cities swallowed by jungle, pyramids older than memory, and people whose ancestors spoke of floods and gods who came from the sea. Though these parallels were superficial, they captured the European imagination. The idea spread that Atlantis might not have vanished but lived on, its descendants building the civilizations of the Americas. By the 17th century, the conversation had shifted from allegory to geography. Theories multiplied. Some placed Atlantis near the Azores, those green islands rising midway across the Atlantic, whose volcanic peaks seemed like the tips of a drowned continent. Others pointed to the Canaries, Madeira, or even the coast of Spain. The more people looked, the more possibilities emerged. Every reef, every sandbank, every unexplained ruin became a potential clue. In 1679, the Swedish scholar Olaus Rudbeck went further than anyone before him. In 4 immense volumes titled Atlantica, He claimed that Atlantis was not in the Atlantic at all, but in Scandinavia. He argued that Sweden, with its ancient stones and northern myths, was the true cradle of civilization. His work was more patriotic than scientific, but it revealed a pattern that would repeat for centuries. People often placed Atlantis where they most wanted it to be. In the Enlightenment era, rational thinkers revisited the question: could Plato's description have a factual basis? Geologists began to understand that the Earth was not fixed. Continents shifted, mountains rose and eroded, seas advanced and retreated. If land could change, perhaps some ancient island really had disappeared. The problem was scale. No evidence could be found for a continent-sized island sinking in recorded history. The Earth changed slowly, not in a single night. Still, the 19th century rekindled hope. The ocean remained largely unexplored, and science was just beginning to sound its depths. Telegraph cables laid across the Atlantic in the 1850s revealed undersea plateaus and mountain ranges. One in particular, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, ran north to south beneath the ocean like the spine of a hidden continent. Writers seized upon it. Perhaps this was the drowned backbone of Atlantis. Then, in 1882, came a book that would define the modern myth, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, written by Ignatius Donnelly, a former U.S. congressman with a passion for lost histories. Donnelly's argument was sweeping and confident. He claimed that all ancient civilizations, from Egypt to the Maya, traced their origins to Atlantis. He described it as a technological superpower that had mastered metalwork, astronomy, and navigation long before the known nations of antiquity. Donnelly's evidence was thin, drawn from similarities between myths, languages, and symbols, but his storytelling was compelling. He wrote with conviction, blending scholarship and imagination. His book became a sensation, selling widely and shaping public thought for generations. In his hands, Atlantis became not only the mother of civilizations, but also a symbol of human potential, proof that greatness could vanish, but also that it might be rediscovered. The scientific community dismissed his claims, but the public embraced them. The idea of a lost world beneath the sea took root in the imagination of an era fascinated by progress and discovery. Only a few decades later, Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea would echo that fascination, sending Captain Nemo's submarine past the ruins of Atlantis. Fiction and theory had merged in the early 20th century. The legend expanded again. Some writers placed Atlantis in the Mediterranean, linking it to the eruption of the volcanic island of Thera, today's Santorini, around 1600 BCE. Archaeologists had found that this eruption had wiped out much of the Minoan civilization, whose palaces and art showed remarkable sophistication. To many, this seemed like a plausible origin for Plato's story, a great island culture destroyed by the sea. The Minoan theory remains one of the most enduring because it aligns with both science and story. Plato wrote of earthquakes, floods, and a maritime empire. Thera had all three. The geography of Crete and Santorini fits his description of concentric harbors and advanced trade. Though not proof, it offered a rational link between memory and myth, between Plato's moral lesson and an event preserved in collective consciousness. Meanwhile, other theories grew ever bolder. Some suggested that Atlantis lay beneath the Sahara Desert, where traces of ancient lakes and circular landforms seemed to match Plato's design. Others pointed to Antarctica, arguing that shifting polar ice had buried an ancient civilization. Still others claimed that the legend described a global flood caused by the melting of ice after the last ice age. Each theory reflected the era's preoccupations: geology, exploration, or environmental change. The Second World War brought new technologies that revealed more of the deep ocean than ever before. Sonar, developed to track submarines, showed the contours of the sea floor in unprecedented detail. Scientists discovered underwater mountains, trenches, and plains that were previously unknown. Each discovery fed imagination. Some believed they saw the outlines of sunken cities. Photographs of unusual formations, natural ridges and terraces, were hailed as ruins. Yet every expedition ended the same way, with fascination, not confirmation that in the latter half of the 20th century, the legend took on new dimensions. Writers connected Atlantis to every mystery that science could not yet explain, from the pyramids to lost technologies, from ancient maps to magnetic anomalies. The idea of a prehistoric advanced civilization appealed to a world wrestling with its own rapid progress. If we could invent machines that flew and split atoms, perhaps others had done so before us and fallen. Atlantis became a metaphor for both achievement and warning at the same time. Serious archaeology continued to strip away fantasy and return to context. Scholars revisited Plato's text line by line, noting that his account was written in the form of a dialogue, not as history, but as a teaching tool. They found no earlier sources mentioning Atlantis, no inscriptions, no parallel myths. The story, they concluded, was self-contained. It was Plato's creation, intended to illustrate philosophy, not geography. Yet, even among scholars, some questions remained open. Could Plato have drawn inspiration from real events, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, or the collapse of Bronze Age societies? Greece itself had seen coastal lands sink during quakes, and ancient records told of islands rising or vanishing overnight. The philosopher may have woven memory and meaning together, grounding allegory in the familiarity of nature's power. By the 21st century, exploration had reached nearly every corner of the globe. Satellites mapped the ocean floor. Deep-sea drones recorded every ridge and valley. Nowhere did they find a continent-sized ruin. But the search continued, shifting from geography to symbolism. Atlantis became less a place than a question about civilization's fragility. Modern scientists, historians, and philosophers alike agree on one point: whether or not Atlantis existed physically, its endurance reveals something essential about humanity. It is the story of loss and memory, of curiosity that refuses to rest. Every culture holds some echo of a vanished world, a golden age ended by change. In that sense, Atlantis belongs to all of them. Today, expeditions still set out from ports around the world, though their goals are quieter. They use sonar, magnetometers, and drones to study submerged settlements off the coasts of Greece, India, and Japan. These real ruins, cities lost to rising seas, show that Plato's imagery was not impossible, only misplaced. The Earth itself is full of Atlantean stories, lands that once held life and now sleep beneath the waves. What the explorers of old sought in myth, science now finds in fact. The ocean, covering most of the planet, hides the evidence of entire chapters of human history. Stone walls beneath the water off the coast of India, ancient harbors near Israel, Neolithic villages under the Black Sea. Each reminds us that the sea has always been both creator and eraser, and yet, none of these places are the Atlantis. Perhaps that is why the search endures. The story is no longer about discovery, but about longing for connection to something larger, something timeless. In that sense, every diver, every researcher, every reader tracing Plato's words is part of the same tradition, the quiet pursuit of understanding where myth ends and memory begins. Atlantis remains unsolved not because the evidence is missing, but because the question it asks has no final answer. What does it mean for a civilization to fall? The waves have settled now. The story that began in the mind of a philosopher more than 2,000 years ago has traveled across oceans, through centuries, and into our own time, still asking the same question. What holds a civilization together? And what makes it fall apart? Atlantis was never just about marble walls or golden temples. It was about balance, the delicate thread that connects progress to wisdom, ambition to restraint. When that thread breaks, the sea rises, not as punishment, but as a reminder that as we look back, it becomes clear that every age has its own Atlantis. Sometimes it is a real place, a city lost to fire, flood, or time. Sometimes it is an idea, a moment when humanity reached too far or forgot what mattered most. The world changes, yet the pattern remains, and perhaps that is why this story still calms us. It does not ask us to believe in myths. It simply invites us to pause, to breathe, to think, to remember how easily the tides of time wash over even the brightest shores as the night deepens and the sound of the sea fades in your mind. Imagine the quiet ocean floor, vast, still, and timeless. Somewhere, beneath that silence, the memory of Atlantis sleeps, not as ruins of stone, but as a thought that everything built with care deserves care to remain, that if you've listened this far, take a moment to let the calm settle in. History, after all, is not just a record of what we've lost. It's a reminder of how much we've learned. And if this quiet journey through the past brought you a moment of peace tonight, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories waiting. Stories of forgotten winters, silent cities, and lives that shaped the world in ways we still feel today. Thank you for listening. Good night, and sleep well.